Harvard Divinity School.
100 Years Rudolf Steiner, December 15th and 16th, 2025.
So our next panelist will be Matthias Fechner, who is a scholar and educator with Trier University and with Dresden University for Stuttgart, Manchester, and Sheffield. And he's been a teacher at Steiner schools and boarding schools for 16 years. So please welcome to.
I'm terribly excited. I feel very honored to be here, but I have to give a trigger warning first. The title of my presentation, The Sacred and Profane Intercultural Origins of Waldorf Education. I'm not going to talk, yes, I talk loud. As I said, I'm terribly excited. I'm not going to talk about the sacred origins, it's just the profane origins. Because this is an academic institution, it is a scientific institution, and I'm talking about the interchangeable elements of Waldorf education, not those elements which are not interchangeable, which you need to keep at all cost. So I'm going to talk about those elements which were delivered through history and also through other institutions, not necessarily connected with Waldorf schools. Also, there will be an information overload, I'm afraid. It's only 20 minutes, so you just take home what you like, otherwise you skip and hopefully enjoy it a little bit at least. So as I said, general connections and theory, this will be part of the lecture, the influences on Waldorf education, but this will be just a small part of all the influences. Reform education is playing a vital part, especially in the late 19th century. So what are the features of this kind of education, and how were these features transferred, concrete, precisely, by individual personalities to the Waldorf schools? This I'm going to explain from Cecil Reddy in Britain, the Abbot's Home School, to Hermann Lietz in Haubinda, to Robert Killian, who was one of the founding teachers of the Waldorfschule am Kanonenweg, the first Waldorfschule in Stuttgart. And then, of course, there was Steiner and others. However, I should hasten to add, these were the profane elements, and they were spiritualized by Rudolf Steiner. That should be understood. So, when there are reforms in education, this is usually triggered, we should also be aware of this, by historic events. This is just a list. What we are concerned with is 1919, World War I, end of World War I. And there was, of course, Rudolf Steiner, but you could also mention Kurt Hahn and Salem. You could mention Fritz Carlson and many, many others. However, one should say that only Steiner was successful. Slight surprise. Also, when there is an historic upheaval and there is a need for education reform, there is a certain pattern according to which the reform is installed. That means there has to be an idea, the spirit. There has to be negotiation with the authorities, with parents, with the general public. That is language. Then there is the implementation. You put it into action, and eventually there is consolidation. This is true for every education reform. This was not invented by me, it's general part of education science. So again, to make this clear, I'm going to talk about the reform education since the 17th century. Also, I need not go into details here because we all know what it means, reform education. This is more interesting. This is, I think it is still a very random selection. What is the supporting wall of Waldorf education? I would start with Pietism, the Frankische Stiftung and Heckers Realschule. This is an influence we can still discern today in Waldorf schools. It's like the head, heart, hand principle. There is no coercion. You have to learn a craft. There is a different school organization. And this is also very spiritual in its way. Then, of course, the Catholic reform in Austria-Hungary, Johann Ignaz Felder's famous school reforms, which changed the Austro-Hungarian Empire and had a direct impact on Rudolf Steiner. For example, field surveying was introduced through Felbiger. This was a huge reform. And yes, while they're field surveying at Waldorf schools, this is a path which needs to be explored. Then, of course, the early reform, Salzmannschule, Gutsmuts. I would even include Friedrich Ludwig Jahn. I do not have time to stay here and expound further. Goetheanism is another important influence. And finally, those education reformers whose ideas did not immediately come into fruition, I would also count them as an influence. That would be Rousseau, Pestalozzi, Fröbel, and even the totally underrated Karl Friedrich Schnell. Then the reform movement. I'm going to expound further on that. Cesaretti's Abt Home School and Lietz rural boarding schools. By the way, we could also consider ether geography, because it is no surprise that the Waldorf School was founded in Stuttgart and Lietz rural boarding schools were mainly based and still are in Thuringia. And this would again lead us to Wilhelm Rhein and Jena. Then the cousins of 1919, again Thuringia, the Bauhaus. Then I would also consider Salem as a cousin of 1919. And of course, the huge Vienna school reform, which was also most successful. And the cousins once removed. Finally, the Black Mountain College in Asheville, North Carolina. There is also a connection. The Hochschule für Gestaltung Ulm, slight connection. And that is a place where I also taught. Cusanus Hochschule, now disbanded, unfortunately. This was an anthroposophically inspired institution of tertiary learning. Other influences, I mean, that is perhaps plain, so I'm not going to discuss that in broad detail. Steiner's educational proposals, his own research, reading, and spirituality, first and foremost, his engagement with current educational trends. He knew very well what other people were doing. His school experiences in Austria-Hungary, his teaching of the Specht family children, his work at the Waldorf School on Kanonenweg, the directives of the school authorities in Stuttgart, or rather the Reichsland-Württemberg, political developments in Germany, the defeat in World War I, which called for a completely different education, the revolution and the republic. In Stuttgart, that was very important. Actually, I come from Stuttgart and part of my family too, so that is part of the history. Debates on school reform since approximately 1819. I'm going to expound on that further. Educational and spiritual experience of the teachers around Rudolf Steiner. One shouldn't underestimate the teachers. I talked to the son of Robert Killian, who was very instrumental and vital in shaping the first college of teachers of the Waldorf school. And he said, well, these teachers were personalities, and they would discuss with Steiner, and they had heated discussions because these were, I mean, they knew what they were doing. And this of course was why they were actually hired. Exchange within the faculty itself of the first Waldorf school, including conversations with students and parents, the needs of the children at Waldorfschule, and of course the written records of the discussions during the conferences and the lectures, because the spoken word differs from the written word. First wave of reform education from 1890 to 1914. And here I'd say that this was an era of great inspiration, new school foundings, but Hermann Lietz and Cesaretti are of particular importance. But it was an epoch, and of course we could also refer to Gustav Wieneken, infamous later on, Paul and Edith Geheb, Francisco Ferrer, Erwin Batiani, František Bakule, Lev Tolstoy, Rabindranath Tagore, Maria Montessori, John Dewey, and many others. So that was an era of reform. Yeah, so I'm very grateful to Jan Göschel. He mentioned Jena and Wilhelm Rhein, because Hermann Lietz, whose ideas, or the components of whose school we can later find at the Waldorf schools, studied in Jena under Wilhelm Rhein and Rudolf Eucken. But he was repelled by the Herbartian pedagogy, and he sought new forms of teaching and living, because Herbart said, you have a plan, There are 4 phases, and this is the way you have to teach and to condition your pupils. Even today in Germany, pupils are taught that way, even if teachers have forgotten about Johann Friedrich Herbert and his influence. Cecil Reddy, on the other hand, had also studied in Jena, and he was strongly influenced by current educational discussions in Germany and by Rhein, and he was a staunch Herbartian. This also involved France. I'm not going into detail here, and also the migration of ideas. So ideas which should later inspire the Waldorf movement also found their way into the Russian Empire via Ludwig Civicki, who translated Desmoulins' writings into Polish. Desmoulins, who would also found a rural boarding school in France, the École de Roche, which is still going today. Yeah, so Hermann Lietz would eventually create, among other schools, Haubinda in 1901. And what were the features of the Landerziehungsheime? We also find that in Waldorf education. No school books, no exams, main lessons, public presentations, a school doctor, text-based certificates, automatic promotion to the next class, annual projects, languages learned by listening, speaking, and singing, learning poetry by heart, school form, the head-heart-hand principle, and of course, as was mentioned by Jan Göschel, the living together in families, in small groups. Now, this is a photo of Haubinda, the main building in the background, and the children are wearing the characteristic Lahmann shirts, they're sold in Dresden, white t-shirts, which are thought to be very comfortable, which would be good for the spirit. Yeah, so this just to make sure this transfer was agreed upon by both sides. Cecil Reddy later on said in a lecture, which is also in print, Dr. Lietz's school and my own are in aims, methods, and organizations so similar that they can, for our purpose today, be most usefully considered as the same. How does Steiner come into that? He visited Haubinda in the summer of 1905, which was then headed by Paul Gehe, founder of Waldorfschule in 1910. Now, what did Steiner see in Haubinda? Now, this kind of transfer didn't work because Steiner said, no, I'm not really convinced. I don't like it. We were once at a boarding school and wanted to watch the most uplifting lesson, religion class. We entered the classroom. There was a boy lying on the windowsill, his legs dangling out of the window. A second boy was crouching on the floor, and the third was lying on his tummy somewhere, his head raised. That was roughly how all the students were scattered around the room. Then the so-called religion teacher came in, and without any particular introduction, began reading a novella by Gottfried Keller. The students accompanied his lecture with a variety of lounging positions. In the original German, it is Räkeleien. Then, when he had finished, the religion class was over and everyone went outside. This experience gave me the image that there was a large sheep pen, Hammelstall, in the original German, next to this boarding school. And a few steps away from it, these students lived. Certainly, these things should not be sharply condemned. There is a lot of goodwill behind them, but it is a complete misunderstanding of what needs to happen for the children of the future. So, now we could also take, well, if I'd be the advocate of the teacher present, whose name was Paul Gehe, I would also reconstruct this. There was no religious education at Haubinda at the time. Instead, the history of religion was taught. I'm quite sure Steiner was aware of this. In chapel, Steiner observed a 40-minute evening gathering held 5 times a week. They only called it chapel. It was kind of a meeting to recreate and to recuperate. This was presumably preceded by a 40-minute physical education class, because if you study the timetables at your Haubinda, you can see that, including a soccer game. So the boys just came in from a soccer game, and this accounts for their relaxed behavior. According to Paul Gehe, various topics were covered in the chapel in the summer of 1905. This is in the school report for 1905, in the Haubinda school report. And he mentions prose writers, Theodor Storm and Gottfried Keller were preferred. Russian poets were read, the Russo-Japanese War was discussed, and works of fine art were shown using a projection apparatus, etc., etc. There remains a question, why did Steiner devalue Gibbs and Lietz teaching? Because I believe that Steiner knew what was going on. But then the transfer actually happened within the reform movement itself. Cutting the long story short, these elements I've been talking about were developed, for example, also at Waldorfschule. This was on August 19th, 1912. Mario Jona was present, and he had a diary, and you can gather it from the diary, what he discussed with Otto Erdmann, who would later found Burg Nordeck. And these were vital elements of reform and also Waldorf education. For example, the Epochenplan. This is an Epochenplan from 1912. And you can see here, it runs throughout the day. So these are 4 epochen in a day, and the epochen are much shorter, actually. So it's different from the Waldorf Epochenplan, but still there it is an Epochenplan. And Mario Jona and Otto Erdmann didn't invent that, because Berthold Otto was the first one, and I also found it in the estate of Otto Erdmann that he had consulted Berthold Otto in drawing up plans like these. So I'm going to skip that. The features, I already mentioned that. The next question is, of course, how did these features still arrive at the Waldorfschule in Stuttgart? The answer is very simple. In Haubinda was a teacher who was also state school educated, Robert Killian, and he had enough of the flat hierarchies, because the pupils would be could discuss on a level with the teachers at Haubinda, and Killian didn't like that. He was looking for something different, and he heard of the Waldorfschule in Stuttgart. He also heard of the Odenwaldschule, and he sent applications to both institutions. Only Waldorfschule reacted quicker. This is what his son told me. And so he went there and joined Waldorfschule. And he, I guess that he must have brought around most of these elements. And his son, Christoph, who unfortunately has died, he also supported this assumption. But I should hasten to add and repeat it. Steiner and his circle of teachers did expand their educational, how many minutes? 5? Oh, that should be enough. Fine, thank you. Expand their educational goals into more spiritual areas. And it also means eurythmy and a conscious view of students, karma. You might also say reincarnation, etc., etc. These are the features of Waldorf schools which should not be changed. Everything else is, as I said before, interchangeable. This is Robert Killian and the Waldorf class of 1920. Distant cousins. This is also interesting because many other schools at the same time developed similar elements. For example, Fritz Carson, the founder of the Karl Marx Schule in Berlin-Neukölln. He also visited the Waldorf school, and he was particularly impressed by eurythmy. He liked that, even though he came from a very secular, almost communist background. And then, of course, there was the Bauhaus. In the Bauhaus, there were 2 currents. One was Walter Gropius. Walter Gropius was very secular, very strict, very bureaucratic. We all know this, the Siedlungen built by Gropius. But there was also Johannes Itten. And Itten was very spiritual, and he also wrote a letter inviting Rudolf Steiner to talk at the Bauhaus, because he wanted to counterbalance Gropius' influence. Unfortunately, it is, as far as I remember, not known whether Steiner actually answered that letter. In actual fact, he never traveled to Weimar to talk at the Bauhaus, which is a shame in a way, I think, but we never know the reasons. And there were others, Gertrud Grunow, for example, Wassily Kandinsky, Paul Klee. So one could call the Bauhaus a distant cousin. Opus. And of course, the Black Mountain College. Because when in 1933, the Bauhaus, these were the last remnants in Berlin-Charlottenburg. They moved to Dessau and then to Berlin-Charlottenburg to a house there, was shut down. Many faculty members eventually emigrated to Asheville, North Carolina to join the Black Mountain College. And my question, of course, was, is there again a connection from the Black Mountain College to Waldorf? Now, this influence didn't come from Europe, but the Black Mountain College, of course, had famous teachers, which then went into curative education. I've just mentioned one case, that is M.C. Richards, and she was an English teacher, and she received a PhD at Berkeley. And she was a Black Mountain College faculty member from 1945 to 51. So this was also the time when the Bauhaus people were very influential. She gave the reading and writing courses. She was one of the most popular teachers there. She belonged to the Black Mountain poets, Robert Greeley, Charles Olson, and others belonged to that group. And in 1948, she founded Black Mountain Press. She was also a potter and an artist besides. And from 1984 to 1999, she was a volunteer at Camp Hill Village, Kimberton, and she was a dedicated anthroposophist. So again, this is a connection to the distant cousins of the Black Mountain College. And this really is the end of my lecture. Thank you for your patience.
Sponsored by the Program for the Evolution of Spirituality.
Copyright 2023, President and Fellows of Harvard College.